From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
The Senate confirms Kash Patel as FBI director and begins a vote-a-rama this hour on a Plan B budget resolution, even as President Trump and House Republicans continue to push for a different package that includes tax cuts.
We'll have more on taxes and tariffs in Bloomberg's exclusive conversation with Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and be joined by Rohit Kumar. He's co-leader of PwC's National Tax Office and former Deputy Chief of Staff to Senator Mitch McConnell, who announced today he won't seek re-election next year.
A lot happened today. New York Governor Kathy Hochul, meantime, deciding not to remove New York City Mayor Eric Adams from office, at least for now. She just announced plans to put restraints on his power instead. The city's comptroller and a mayoral candidate, Brad Lander, joins us ahead later this hour with Reaction. Thanks for joining us on the Thursday edition, the late edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. This morning at CPAC, Vice President J.D. Vance had this to say about the different budget plans now floating through two chambers of Congress.
So the Senate obviously has its own approach. And the president has been very clear that his preference is to put everything in one bill.
Right.
And part of that is just simple legislative strategy. I think the president has learned a lot about how D.C. works. And I actually talked to the president about this yesterday, and he said to me, look, it's very rare that you can get two reconciliation bills done in one Congress, which is why he thinks we've got to do a lot with that one big, beautiful bill, that first reconciliation package that we're going to get through the House and the Senate.
Joining us now is someone who knows a little bit about the workings of the U.S. Senate in particular. Rohit Kumar is with us. He's co-leader of PwC's National Tax Office and also former Deputy Chief of Staff for Senator Mitch McConnell. Rohit, welcome back.
Thanks for having
to
me.
Bloomberg. It's nice to see you in our D.C. studio. So when we consider this Plan B that the Senate says it's working on, just a fail-safe option in case the House can't get it together on one big bill, how does it ultimately potentially change the end game of what this looks like, knowing the Senate is looking for permanency of the 2017 tax cuts? The House is looking potentially just an extension given the parameters they're working with.
Yeah, so the one bill, two bill thing is actually a different question than the permanent versus temporary question. So what the Senate's doing, look, the Senate was going to have to pass a budget resolution one way or the other. There is no way to get from here to the finish line with the Senate doing the 50 hours of debate that they did this week, the endless voting on amendments that they're going to start today and go into tomorrow. And what they will do is they will send their version of the budget resolution, assuming it passes, and I think it will, to the House. Right? And the House is, if the House is to be taken at its word, they are going to try to pass their version of a budget resolution. Well, this is just schoolhouse rock, how a bill becomes a law. The House has a bill, the Senate has a bill. These are not bills, they're resolutions, but nevertheless, they can go to conference, hammer out the differences, and pass a final version on the floor of both chambers. Or if over the weekend or early next week, or even while the House is debating its version of the resolution, the House and the Senate can come to some mutual agreement, would probably require the intervention of the White House to kind of forge a compromise. They could reflect that in what passes the House. They could even amend it at the very end of the process and say, this is the final agreement, ship it back to the Senate. The Senate would have to pass it again, 10 hours of debate, and then send it to the president, not send it to the president, pass it, and then be done. Right? And that would then set up, this is just a kind of the chassis of a piece of legislation. It's not the bill itself.
Sure.
It just sets the parameters for the substantive legislation that follows. So what the Senate was doing this week, they were going to have to do this eventually at some point anyway. And I think they decided, not irrationally, hey, we've kind of got the week scheduled. We have the votes to pass it this week. The very first Senate Republican leader I worked for, Trent Lott, said, take the vote when you're going to win the vote. You got the votes this week. You take the vote this week. You get it out of the Senate. And then you see, as yet unproven, but let's see, if the House can pass the version that would contemplate doing all of this in one piece of legislation, as Vice President Vance just discussed.
So it's almost like you've been through this before. You survived more than one vote-a-rama with a Republican Senate Majority Leader, whether it was Trent Lott, Mitch McConnell. John Thune gets his first turn tonight. What's the Democratic strategy to try to gum this up? Are they going to be still working when the sun rises tomorrow?
They'll probably still be working when the sun rises tomorrow. Look, if you're in the minority, I will say this, I've been both in the majority and the minority for these vote-a-ramas. And when you're in the minority, you will have no more fun than in a vote-a-rama when you're in the minority, because there is no idea that is too crazy to get a vote.
And they're parsing out ideas now. Everybody takes an amendment and
Everybody
goes for
takes an amendment, everyone gets ideas, and then some senators will have their own ideas. Whether you at the staff level think it's a good idea or a bad idea is not relevant. They get to offer it because they're the senator.
Yeah.
And essentially what you're doing is you're trying to put the majority party on record in ways that you think will be politically damaging to them in the next election cycle, right? And you're just planting 1,000 seeds. You're like scattering them into the wind. You don't know which one's going to germinate, which one's going to go viral, which one's going to be the one that becomes the attack ad that causes somebody real electoral distress in their next election. So that is essentially what you're doing. You are just throwing spaghetti against the wall. I don't know which of these is going to stick, but I get a chance to try every one of these. And basically, it doesn't end until the senators are just too tired to continue to offer amendments. That's why Senator Thune, Senate Majority Leader Thune, is likely to keep them in overnight. You take no breaks when you're in the majority. You don't want to give the minority party the chance to go home, get rested, refuel, and come back loaded for bear. You just plow through the night. And at some point tomorrow, probably before the sun sets tomorrow, they will be done and they will send this bill to the House.
Of course, the aim here in part is to advance funding for border security, change energy policy, and then, of course, enact not just an extension or a permanency of the 2017 tax cuts, but a whole host of other things that President Trump has put forward, which he argues, as he did at the Future Investment Initiative Institute in Miami yesterday, might be partially offset by tariffs. Here's what the president said last night.
The new Trump tax cuts will also include 100% expensing for new factory construction in the United States. If you buy something that is going to be good for our country, we're going to let you expense it. We're trying to balance the budget immediately, and because of the tariff income, which is really, it's already turned out to be amazing, actually. It's really meant more for bringing countries and companies into our country.
So it becomes a question of math here. If you're having more companies in the U.S. than paying U.S. taxes, I guess, but there's also tariffs that are in place that are affecting revenue, and he wants to see lower corporate taxes for companies in the U.S. anyway. How does the math, all of this realistically work out? What offsets are we really going to see from tariffs specifically? Yeah,
so it's an open question about how much tariff revenue we're actually going to collect at the end of the day, because so far what we have seen is tariffs as a tool of leverage, which even free trade Republicans have said, look, tariffs as leverage to get better market access, to get, concessions, whether they be trade concessions or other policy concessions, immigration policy concessions in the case of Canada and Mexico. That's an understandable use of tariffs. But we have not yet being the operative word here, seen sort of tariffs at scale for duration. That is like a new additional source of revenue. And there are real questions about whether that would be a durable source of revenue. What would be the inflationary pressures of that on consumers to the extent that those prices can't be just absorbed by the exporters into the U.S., but end up having to be passed along to consumers. But look, it is clear the president has broad tariff authority. This president seems quite wired to use that authority to the maximum extent possible. I think it will probably end up being a mix of tariffs for revenue and tariffs as leverage for some negotiation, whether that's a trade negotiation or some other policy negotiation, remains to be seen.
We wanted to ask you, while you're here, about your old boss. Senator Mitch McConnell, of course, no longer majority leader, had something pretty important to announce today on the Senate floor.
My current term in the Senate will be my last. Lest any of our colleagues still doubt my intentions for the remainder of my term, I have some unfinished business to attend to. I assure our colleagues that I will depart with great hope for the endurance of the Senate as an institution. There are any number of reasons for pessimism, but the strength of the Senate is not one of them.
So maybe not a big shock for insiders like you, but I want to know what work he thinks he has left. What role will he play for the next couple of years?
So I think for the duration of his term, he's going to continue to be a voice for a muscular U.S. foreign policy. You've already seen, even during the last 2 years of the Biden administration, really kind of beating the drum for the need to support Ukraine in its defense.
Does that make him automatically a Trump foil?
I don't know that it automatically makes him a Trump foil across the board, but on areas where he disagrees, and you've already seen this in his votes on nominees or votes against nominees, Where he has a different point of view, he will express that through his vote, through his rhetoric, through his speeches. He is chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee for the Defense Department. I expect it will be expressed there as well. As we talked about, as a part of this budget reconciliation process, there's additional funding for the Defense Department. I would expect he will have a hand in how that gets played out. But I think his primary his vision for self for the next 2 years will be to be a defender of a sort of Reagan-esque, muscular U.S. foreign policy, commitment to NATO, commitment to our allies, commitment to other democracies, and opposition to tyranny, opposition to Russia, right? He is, one of the original Russia hawks, forged in the Cold War of the 80s. I think that's where I see him continuing to speak vocally over the course of the next, let's call it, 22 months.
Well, as you raised the notion that he came to the Senate in 1984, when it was the era of Reagan, he will leave it in 2027 when it's the era of Donald Trump. Will he be remembered for holding on to a Republican Party that had already kind of long moved past him by the time he actually left?
So I think he is trying to fight the moving past. I think he thinks that's a mistake, and he's going to try to make the argument as articulately as he can that it is a mistake to, quote, move on, that this is not the trajectory that we should be on, that this is a mistake, and that if we pursue it, that we will eventually regret it. Now, whether he'll be successful, it's too early to tell, but I think that's where he's going to try.
Mitch McConnell, 83 years old today.
Yeah, it's his birthday.
Happy birthday to Mitch McConnell. Rohit Kumar, great to have you back with us. He's co-leader of PwC's National Tax Office, former Deputy Chief of Staff to Senator McConnell. We thank you, as always, for the insights. Coming up, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent floats relieving Russian sanctions as part of negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. Part of his conversation today with Bloomberg. You'll hear it next on Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I love Ukraine, but Zelenskiy has done a terrible job. His country is shattered, and millions of people have unnecessarily died. And you can't bring a war to an end if you don't talk to both sides. You got to talk. They haven't been talking for 3 years. So we hope to see a ceasefire soon and to reestablish stability in Europe and the Middle East.
President Trump speaking at the Foreign Investment Summit in Miami last night. Today on Bloomberg TV and radio, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent also spoke about the war in Ukraine, having just returned from Kyiv himself, where he met with President Zelenskiy. Here's what he had to say about the elevated tensions now between Zelenskiy and Trump.
I think President Zelenskiy, unfortunately, escalated and has put some daylight between.
How did he escalate?
A lot of his remarks in Munich I thought were inappropriate. President Zelenskiy, when I met with him, assured me that he'd be signing the minerals deal in Munich. He has not. And look, the real purpose here, and I think it's turned into kind of this media circus, that President Trump had a very elegant plan, and it was bring the Ukrainians closer to the U.S. Let's do this economic deal. And even Karl Rove in the Wall Street Journal this morning approves of it, that the U.S., with greater economic interest in Ukraine, provides a security shield. So the sequencing of what was going to happen was bring the Ukrainians closer to the U.S. Through economic ties, convince the American people and the American public, get them on side, and then tell the Russians, go to the negotiating table with a very fulsome message that if we need to, we will take sanctions up.
Well, what about tapping the Russian frozen assets, some $300 billion? Would you force your European counterparts to not just have them frozen, but actually tap them? Trump talks about repaying the American taxpayer. Shouldn't Russia be a part of that?
Well, what's happening now is they are being tapped. So the returns from
the interest,
the returns from the freezed asset pile is going to pay the Europeans. You know, what's very important to understand here is that everything the U.S. has done to date, the American people, the American taxpayer, is grants. The Europeans, roughly half of what they've done are loans, and the runoff from the frozen assets is being used to repay European loans.
Have you communicated that to the Europeans? that you're upset with them?
What's that?
Have you communicated to the Europeans that you're upset with them?
I think Vice President Vance did a pretty good job in Munich.
Do you think they understand that the United States is running a deficit of north of 6%, close to 7%, and that the budget for defence is north of $800 billion? Do you think they understand the gravity of the moment in the United States, the U.S. perspective?
Look, I think that they understand that President Trump, during his first term, this term, Vice President Vance, and the entire security apparatus have told them that many of the countries are deficient in their NATO spending, and they need to come up.
You can find the full conversation with Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent online or on the terminal. And joining us now for more on the Secretary's comments is Bloomberg's national security reporter, Dan Flatley. So, Dan, on the conversation with Ukraine, he not only talked about this notion of the two countries coming together closer economically through a rare earth deal, but also talked about sanctions as potentially being something of a negotiating tool here in these conversations with Russia. What have we learned about the role that economic initiatives are ultimately playing in efforts toward peace?
I think that economic issues are going to play a huge role in these negotiations as they play out. Obviously, Russia wants sanctions relief. They want sanctions relief on the $300 billion in sovereign assets that have been frozen or blocked as a result of this war. They want sanctions relief on their energy sales. They want sanctions relief on their financial institutions, on some of their prominent officials. So there's many things on that side of the ledger that that Russia is interested in. From the U.S. perspective, they have the ability to either ramp up those sanctions or potentially trim some of them down. And that's kind of what Secretary Bessent was alluding to in his remarks today and talking about was, we got to get the Russians to the negotiating table. That's a scenario in which we may take the sanctions up. We may increase them. But we also have the carrot and the stick, and the carrot would be some sanctions relief. And so that's definitely on the table, as we've sort of learned, certainly over the last few days, but, in more explicit terms this morning.
Treasury Secretary indicating in that conversation that Kyiv has not helped itself in dealing with the Trump administration. Former Congressman Patrick McHenry echoed that sentiment here at the table today, that they did not ingratiate themselves, that they overplayed their hand. They did something to distance themselves with Donald Trump to the point where he's calling President Zelensky a dictator. What happened?
Well, we know that Zelensky made some comments talking about Trump potentially being under the influence of misinformation, Russian disinformation, wanting more truth in the conversation. Obviously, he has a perspective as the president of a country that's at war, that was invaded by a foreign nation, by Russia in this case. Certainly passions are running high with him, and understandably so. He also refused to go to Saudi Arabia after we saw the U.S. and the Russian delegation meet there. Probably because he felt he couldn't get a square deal the way things were shaping up, so he needed to, to sort of do something to communicate that. This has been sort of a consistent theme over the last few years with Zelensky, where he's sort of gotten a little bit hot under the collar about some of the support that he's gotten from the U.S. and the Europeans. This case is different because Trump, said some stuff about Zelensky that was a little bit different than perhaps he's used to being spoken to by a U.S. president. He called him, said that elections need to happen, called him a dictator, as you said. Right. So I think that this deal is not dead. I mean, there's still stuff that Zelensky can do to help himself, but obviously not great.
We'll see what happens when these two presidents meet. Dan, thank you. Bloomberg's Dan Flatley from our national security team. Coming up, billionaire Texas real estate developer Ross Perot Jr. raising red flags over President Trump's tariff threats. How he's preparing for potential price hikes on essential foreign-made materials. Next on Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Yesterday, Bloomberg's Texas bureau chief Julie Fine sat down with Ross Perot Jr., chairman of the Perot Group and longtime Republican donor, and asked him about his concerns regarding President Trump's tariff plans.
Well, it's obviously a concern as a real estate developer, and so we've got billions of projects lined up that we're going to build this year. And so we have to really bend over backwards to make sure we know the impact of steel and aluminum and what will the pricing be. And if they go through, how are we going to handle it? And will the clients pay the extra price? Because it will add cost to these buildings. But also, it's a little bit early. Let's see what really happens. But we're preparing for it to happen.
Is it affecting you? Is it affecting
it affects us
business
right now because all the American steel producers are raising their price. And so even without a tariff, prices are going up, and we've got to manage through that price increase.
Joining us now for a closer look at their conversation is Bloomberg's Texas Bureau Chief, Julie Fine. So, Julie, what else was your takeaway from your words with him?
Well, I will tell you a major takeaway for me is right after that question, I said, so do you have any buyer's remorse? Are you concerned about things moving forward? I mean, he has no buyer's remorse. He says he's definitely still a Trump supporter. He believes that President Trump was the right person for the business economy. But like both of you who have spoke to many Republicans who express a lot of doubt about certain parts of what's happening right now, they still continue to support the president. My question there is, how long does that last?
Yeah, so again, he mentioned steel. That's one thing, but there are so many tariff threats. Julie, find that it's hard to tell what's going to be implemented. Does Ross Perot Jr. think all of these tariffs will eventually be put into place?
I mean, I think he's trying to plan for as many as possible. He was discussing that in contracts there may have to be a line for tariffs. So whether the uncertainty makes it so they have to plan for them, whether they actually happen or not. Of course, we've heard many Republicans talk about these as tariffs, but when you're actually in the business every day and you need the supplies and you've got long-term plans, you really have to plan for them like they might happen.
Julie, we just have a minute left here, but I know you also discussed the DOGE with him. What did he tell you?
It's interesting. He supports Elon Musk. He knows Elon Musk from business in Texas. He says he thinks he's doing the right thing getting involved in government. So I said, how do you feel about USAID and all the cuts that are being made? He really turned it to Congress and said, shouldn't Congress have been identifying all along places where there could be cuts in government? So he's fully supportive of him being involved right now in the government, knowing him from a business sense here in Texas.
Well, he's not the first to ask that question openly here on Bloomberg. Julie Fine with us live from Texas. Thanks for sharing part of the conversation with us here, of course, on Balance of Power. We'll keep tabs on the congressional process with votes today. A vote-a-rama getting underway in the Senate tonight as they work on a budget resolution. Votes in the House next week on that version. Coming up, though, a breaking story we're following closely today. New York Governor Kathy Hochul deciding not to remove New York City Mayor Eric Adams from office for now. We'll speak ahead with Brad Lander, the city's controller and mayoral candidate. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
After careful consideration, I have determined that I will not commence removal proceedings at this time. My strong belief is that the will of the voters and the supremacy and sanctity of democratic elections preclude me from any other action. I cannot deny the people of this great city the power to make this decision for themselves.
New York Governor Kathy Hochul, just in the last hour, they're saying she will not remove New York City Mayor Eric Adams from office, at least for now, even though she does have the power to begin that process, something we've learned a lot about this week. As we consider the way forward here, I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington as we prepare to bring in Brad Lander, the New York City Comptroller, I should say. Kaylee, this is a really interesting moment because we were waiting for a judge's ruling on this case today. It did not come. Judge Ho decided not to determine whether these corruption charges should be dropped against the mayor of New York.
And it is those charges and the fact that the Justice Department initiated the dropping of them, or the attempt to at least, that raised concerns around a quid pro quo with the Trump administration and why this kind of reignited this crisis in New York City after the original indictment in the fall. Now, obviously, what Kathy Hochul has decided to do here is not to oust Adams and what she sees as overturning the will of New York City voters, but instead establishing a series of guardrails that will provide a bit more of a check on the powers of the office that he was elected to.
Yeah, that's right. And there are 3 of them specifically, including creating a special inspector general for New York City affairs. And that's where we're able to start our conversation right now. An inside view of what's going on with the help of Brad Lander, New York City's controller, as I mentioned. He's also a Democratic mayoral candidate. And it's great to have you with us, sir. You were in an important closed-door meeting with Governor Hochul yesterday, you and other stakeholders in the city. How did we get from a possible ouster in 24 hours to this talk of sanctions or guardrails? What was said in that meeting that got us here?
Well, look, what's important is making sure we've got a continuity of government services, right? That's what New Yorkers are relying on. There's going to be a snowstorm tonight. We don't have deputy mayors as a result of the resignations. So, that's what the governor's focused on. That's what I'm focused on. There's still a lot more we have to see. We have to see what Judge Ho does. We have to see, I've called on the mayor for a contingency plan to say what he's going to do about the replacement of the deputy mayors. But I think our first focus just has to be on making sure this great city is served, that the garbage gets picked up, and that government is there for the emergencies and crises that people need.
Well, so who is in charge right now?
I mean, right now, Eric Adams is in charge, but New Yorkers are right to be concerned.
But practically, and making sure those things are getting done with all those deputy mayors resigning.
Well, thankfully, they've stuck around. They said, we'll stick around for a few more weeks until new deputy mayors are put in place, which is why I've called on the mayor to say, OK, what's the contingency plan? Who are you hiring? But look, you're right. New Yorkers are asking the question, does the mayor work for us or does he work for Donald Trump? And that's why we really need Judge Ho to say he's not going to allow the Justice Department to turn this prosecution into a sword of Damocles hanging over Eric Adams' head.
Well, so what are you hearing, Mr. Lander? You're the city's controller. You hear a lot more stuff than we do. Outside of an interview on Fox on Friday morning, is there evidence of a quid pro quo? Was the mayor going to do the work of the Trump administration for some unsavory reason that would result in his ouster?
Well, look, last week, Elon Musk reached in and stole $80 million from a New York City bank account, and Eric Adams didn't speak up about it. And then yesterday, Donald Trump said he's the king and tried to overturn a congestion pricing policy that's reducing traffic and cleaning our air and investing in our subways. And Eric Adams didn't say anything about that either. So New Yorkers are right to be concerned that he is doing the bidding of Donald Trump and not serving the interests of New Yorkers. And that's what makes this a really precarious moment.
Well, and hence the guardrails going in, one of which announced by the governor today is to propose additional funds for your office, for the New York City Comptroller. Have you had a moment to think through what that actually means? What additional power will that give you and over the mayor, who also happens to be a political rival in some sense in this Democratic primary?
Well, the first thing I'm going to do with the additional powers that the governor has given is go into court to make sure we get the $80 million back that I mentioned. That's money that Congress authorized, that we have a contract for, and they came into our bank account with no notice, no warning, and no legal basis. I called on the mayor to go into court to get it back, but now with this new authority that the governor is proposing, I'd be able to go into court and fight for making sure New York City gets all its money and can prevent this from happening in the future.
So you're running for mayor yourself. We know that you've been at odds with Eric Adams politically, Mr. Lander. With that said, if you were running the city of New York, if you were the next mayor of New York City, would you help to implement the Trump administration's immigration policies in the city?
When people have been convicted of serious or violent crimes, New York City law facilitates coordination on their deportation. But when that's not the case, when people have not been convicted of crimes, we don't let ICE agents into our schools or our police precincts or our hospitals because we want people to be able to report crimes or to, if they're victims of domestic violence, to get the help they need or to send their kids to school. And those are the laws of New York City, and as mayor, I would uphold them.
Well, when we consider what's happening in New York City, we, of course, got separate news this week unrelated to this saga around Mayor Adams from the Department of Transportation as the federal government rescinded its approval for congestion pricing. We know Governor Hochul is taking legal action to try to counter that. But what will it mean for New York, not only for congestion, for the MTA, concerns around the budget, if this isn't reinstated?
Well, first, we still have it. It doesn't need to be reinstated. It just needs to continue.
I mean, on a permanent basis.
Donald Trump does not have authority to stop it. So I just want to start there. I mean, congestion pricing is working. Traffic is down. Crossing times for the tunnels and bridges from Jersey and Brooklyn into the city are down 30 to 50%. More people are on mass transit. There's actually more foot traffic in Midtown than there was. And we're getting hundreds of millions of dollars for our subways and buses. The federal government approved.
I think we may have a little trouble with our connection with Brad Lander. We'll see if we can reconnect with New York City's Comptroller, the Democratic mayoral candidate, also with us talking about the situation. Kathy Hochul, Kaylee, today said New York is facing a grave threat from Washington. That was a direct quote, and it sounds like we have a comptroller who's ready to go to court.
Well, yeah, he said that's what he intends to use these extra funds that would be appropriated to his office through this Guardrails plan. And of course, this story is not yet over. We still have to hear from that judge on whether these charges are actually going to be dropped, and that could influence the way in which decision-making is made from here.
We'll have to get the comptroller back to talk more.
Yep, and we appreciate his time joining us on Balance of Power today. And we still have more ahead as the Senate budget resolution vote-a-rama is beginning this evening. And we'll have more on the dueling strategies between the two chambers of Congress with our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
They want one bill. They want to maximize that one bill, which means that one bill will not be fast, which is what Senator Thune, Majority Leader Thune, was trying to achieve. And Senator Graham is saying, let's get policy wins fast and show progress. And what you heard from the Treasury Secretary was what matters is the economy and our economic impact, which is what we need to get done fast and first, which means you got a big bill.
Patrick McHenry, the former Republican congressman from North Carolina and House Financial Services Committee chair, on the early edition of Balance of Power today, talking about the administration's preference for the House's one-bill budget reconciliation strategy. The Senate, however, is beginning votes this evening on their own competing budget resolution. Joining us now for more is this evening's political panel. Sarah Chamberlain, president and CEO of the Republican Main Street Partnership and Republican strategist, alongside Kristen Hahn, Democratic strategist and Rock Solutions partner. Welcome to you both. Sarah, the Senate is arguing that what they're doing here is just making sure a plan B is established. They are trying to create a solution in case there's a problem in the House. But are they actually making a problem in the House with this entire process by going ahead with this evening?
Actually, I think at this point they're smart with pushing through the two bills in the Senate, because the House, I mean, we all know the House is very close. It doesn't always run as smoothly as possible, so they're giving us a good plan B. But we are in the House in the next couple of weeks going to get this through as one bill. I don't think we can pass a two-bill strategy in the House of Representatives. So we have to get one bill, get it done, get everybody in line, and get it over the goal.
So is there a strategy that's coming from the White House here? Did Donald Trump talk to Lindsey Graham on the golf course and say, you know what, we need to light a fire into the House here. Do me a favor, get Plan B going in the Senate?
I mean, it could have happened, but I totally agree that, you know, the two-bill strategy, I mean, if you look at just the politics of the situation, the Senate has a much bigger majority as far as the Republicans are concerned than the House. And so you have to consider the politics of what's going on. And at the end of the day, in the House, you're not just looking at a coalition of people, you know, of different factions of the Republican conference. You're talking about one or two individuals that could impact this process. And some people really like to do that. You've seen that in the past where they're holding up things for no good reason. And we've seen that with the debt limit increase and other items. So, you know, I think Trump putting his finger on the scale was actually pretty smart for the one-bill strategy, because I think Sarah's right. There's no way that two bills are going to pass this Congress.
Well, and obviously we're working on a little bit of a longer timeline here with the reconciliation process than another timeline, which is that March 14th government funding deadline that also needs to be sorted out. If the House is prioritizing budget reconciliation in the next few weeks, Sarah, what's the plan to make sure the lights don't turn off mid-next?
Well, they're also doing that. I mean, publicly
Are they making progress?
They are making some progress, though quite slowly, but they are making progress. I'm hoping the government will not shut down. I cannot guarantee, I usually do, but they are making progress. I think we're going to be fine.
If this is a short-term CR, or they need to buy more time, get the summer to write some real legislation.
It's probably going to be.
Freedom Caucus is going to hate whatever your answer is.
Right, so it doesn't really matter because they don't care. Yeah. Probably into June.
Okay.
If it has to go their way, but they're really working with some of the extremists. I call them rhinos because they're not really Republicans.
Oh, boy.
If they're trying to get them onto the right page to support the Republican Party and frankly Donald Trump's agenda. He needs this done. I mean, there's no doubt about it. We've got to get this over the threshold here.
Well, and then, of course, we have to ask the question about the role of Democrats, because usually for must-pass legislation, whether it's raising the debt ceiling or just trying to keep the lights on, those votes have shown up, at least in the last few years. You told us earlier this week, though, Kristen, you think the odds of that happening this time are possibly the lowest they've ever been. Can they be improved in just the next few weeks?
Potentially, if there's outreach to some of the Democrats. I mean, if you look, past his prologue, you look at the Democrats have provided the votes for not shutting down government, reopening government, raising the debt limit. And I think sometimes those votes may be taken for granted, right? So in talking with some of the moderate Democrats, there hasn't been the outreach, not by the leadership of the Republican Party, maybe by some of the other members, and I don't know, but maybe your members. Yeah. I think that you will have to have Democratic votes to keep the government open. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, when Hakeem Jeffries and the leaders of the Democratic Party get together, what is that, what are they looking at here? There's so much going on they don't agree with. I just think I stand by my statement that I think that the possibility of them, really engaging and doing this is far fewer than it was before.
You had the complexities of the DOGE in this conversation. Gets to be really interesting, seeking spending cuts here, but also trying to turn it into some form of legislation. While speaking at the financial summit in Miami last night, President Trump floated this idea about how to use whatever savings the DOGE comes up with.
I signed an order creating the Department of Government Efficiency and put a man named Elon Musk in charge. They're curbing inflation and saving taxpayers billions and billions of dollars every single day. And there's even under consideration a new concept where we give 20% of the DOGE savings to American citizens and 20% goes to paying down debt, because the numbers are incredible.
Enter the DOGE dividend. By the way, Elon Musk showed up swinging a chainsaw around at CPAC. That's happening right now. How does the membership feel about this, the Main Street membership? Because this was supposed to also bring down the deficit. But we're talking about sending checks to Americans a la COVID.
So first of all, they're talking about doing both. And I think Donald Trump would like to sign the checks, as he did during COVID, because people thought that Donald Trump sent them money. So I think we're in that dynamic. But our members are really in support of this if they're real cuts. I mean, it has to be a legitimate, okay, we can cut here, we can cut there. And I think the American people support that. We're certainly finding in the Republican Main Street Partnership members' districts that their average population is, thank you, you're finally doing something about government waste. Defense Department is next, and there's a whole mess in the Defense Department that hopefully they can get cleaned up.
I just want to apologize for those listening on Bloomberg Radio who didn't get to just see the video on Bloomberg TV and on YouTube of the chainsaw. The Argentinian president, mind you, is the one who brought the chainsaw out onto the stage and gave it to Elon Musk to wield around. He has a chain on and some sunglasses.
Yeah,
the whole dark MAGA thing is very active on that stage. When we consider the notion of this DOGE dividend, though, Kristen, of more money going into the pockets potentially of Americans if this were to happen at a time when Democrats' primary argument against a lot of the Trump policies is that they're trying to provide tax cuts not to everyday Americans but to billionaires. How would that mess up the messaging?
I think messaging is an entirely different game these days with the Trump administration. They clearly do not care about quote unquote mainstream media. They care about what people are seeing. You look at the press secretary who goes on and is very effective at delivering 45-second speeches, not speeches, but delivers a message in 45 seconds. She knows it's going to go viral. Do you want this to bring down the deficit? People don't really know what it takes, and it's not saying that there's no reason why they should. You have to deal with entitlement reform, tax reform. None of this stuff makes sense. But you don't have to be intellectually honest about it, and we're all talking about how it's not intellectually honest. Do you want to bring down the debt and deficit? Do you want to give the checks back? the messaging is all over the place, but it's clear that in some ways the Trump administration is winning on this messaging. You know, they don't really care about who they invite into the press briefing room, except for the people who are going to put things out on Twitter. Don't have to be mainstream media outlets. So I don't think they're going to fail.
Entitlements are an important part of this, not to interrupt, but the House bill is very different when it comes to Medicaid. And it kind of runs counter to what Donald Trump has suggested, even though he endorsed that bill. Where's the membership on this?
Membership wants to continue to talk about it. Like, remember, the House is out this week.
Yes.
So when they come back next week, this will be on their agenda to start to talk about, like, what do we do? Again, legitimate cuts, look for fraud. There's always fraud in all of this. That's where they'd like to cut first and then move on to have a further discussion about how do we handle this. But what we are finding back in the districts and what the phone calls are, the people don't understand deficit. What they understand is a check for $5,000 that comes back to them. I think the Democratic messaging would be extremely difficult if people start getting $5,000 checks. Because, again, a deficit is a number to them. It doesn't really affect their daily lives. We all know it's a problem. People listening know it's a problem. But the average American is like, wow, I got $5,000. This is wonderful.
And also, what is good governance when you have people who know what they're talking about? You have Elon Musk who knows that, like, if we're talking about drawing down the debt and deficit, part of that is educating the public, because I totally agree with you. They don't quite understand, you know, what it means to do that and the hard decisions that you have to make, the ones that are currently being made and the ones you have to deal with in entitlement reform. So, you know, giving everybody a $5,000 check, it may be the easy political route, but it's not the one that's actually going to make the dent in the deficit.
Important reminder about what happens inside the Beltway and beyond it, and how certain things are paid more attention to here in Washington than elsewhere. And this may be the case for the next thing I want to bring up, which is Senator Mitch McConnell, of course, the longest-serving Republican leader in the Senate, announcing today, Sarah, that he will not seek re-election. Perhaps not too surprising, but he suggested he has more work to do in the Senate. What are you bracing for in terms of his potential opposition to some of what Republicans might want to achieve in the next few years?
I think he's not going to be a guarantee yes. I mean, we've seen he's voted against quite a few of Donald Trump's nominees. So I think he'll be a swing vote. He might even join occasionally with the women, which is Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski. Right. So you're going to see maybe the real Mitch McConnell come out the last 2 years. He's never going to run again. He's not going to have to worry about it. And we all know he's not the biggest fan of President Trump's. So, you know, this is how he ends his career. It's going to be interesting. But, you know, he served the country well.
Would the
so
real
you have
Mitch
to appreciate
McConnell step forward?
Right.
Could you imagine an insurgency in the Republican caucus named Mitch McConnell?
Oh, my gosh. I can't believe it.
Isn't that what we're talking about?
I don't know. I mean, we were all watching some of his votes, like Sarah mentioned, and I was like, oh, is he unleashed? Like, this is just him coming out doing whatever he wants, you know? It's
but he
amazing.
is very close to Thune, so I don't know if he'll be too much of a problem, because he's not going to want to cost
Well, they have
Thune
respect for the Senate. And,
He did on the floor when he was announcing that he won't seek re-election, talked about how he will leave with enduring faith in the Senate as an institution.
Well, that's what he goes down as for sure. He's got 2 more years almost to make trouble. Great conversation with our great panel. Many thanks to Sarah Chamberlain, Kristen Hahn for being with us today on Balance of Power. Coming up, we'll take a look at what's next on the docket here in Washington. Another busy 24 hours ahead. Starts tonight, in fact. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
One of the big reasons I'm president today is because of the black vote, and I always appreciate it. So this is a very special time. It's Black History Month. We love you all. We're going to work with you. We're going to make America greater than ever before. We're going to do it together, and I want to thank you all for being here. It's an incredible honor. And to my great golfing friends, I want to thank them in particular.
President Trump had an event honoring Black History Month just a bit earlier today at the White House. Among those who were there Presidential Medal of Freedom recipient Tiger Woods. Look at the phones if you're with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube. That's what these East Room events have become, just a sea of cell phones to take pictures. So, Kayleigh, we've got another stop for Donald Trump. He's speaking at the Republican Governors Association dinner tonight. And that's just the start of what could be a very late evening here in Washington, or maybe early morning, I should say.
Especially if you're a member of the U.S. Senate, you might be in for an all-nighter as they begin the vote-a-rama on this budget resolution, their plan B to accomplish Trump's legislative agenda. This is outlining, dividing it into two parts. Democrats have a lot of amendments they're going to put forward, and that's going to extend this thing possibly into the wee hours.
Yeah, we'll be talking about this tomorrow on Balance of Power for sure. Then it's back to CPAC. We already saw the speech from Vice President J.D. Vance, Donald Trump, the headliner, Saturday night. You see Elon with the chainsaw earlier. He was just followed by Steve Bannon to be backstage.
And we'll have more coverage of that for you tomorrow on Balance of Power. We'll see you then on Bloomberg TV and radio.